Hello and welcome to A Word on the Word with Les and Tracy King.
Now in this session, we'll be looking at an important figure of apostolic age whose name was James.
James was martyred around 62 or 69 AD, and now James is also referred to as James the Just.
Or as James, the brother of the Lord.
It's agreed by most theologians, though, that James the Just is not the same James referred to in the Bible as James, the brother of John.
Or James, the son of Zebedee.
Jesus did have several brothers and sisters, though.
He did, but James and Jude are the only ones mentioned elsewhere in the New Testament.
James is mentioned as one of the early leaders of the early church in Jerusalem.
And Jude in the short letter bearing his name.
That's right. So we're going to go ahead and move on to our first biblical thought, and that is our resistance only brings his persistence.
And we're reading in John chapter 7, verse 5. It says, "For even his own brothers did not believe in him."
We see here that originally Jesus' family was rather skeptical about his ministry.
And as it was with many of us, I think we need to have some serious encounter with the resurrected Jesus to change our minds.
Absolutely. So what we see here in 1 Corinthians chapter 15, verse 7, it says here that then he appeared to James, and then he went and he appeared to all the other apostles, right?
That's right.
Apparently, the resurrection changed James' mind here, and Jesus knew that even though he didn't believe in him early on, he's going to go ahead and go appear to him after the resurrection and give him a wake-up call, right?
That would do it, wouldn't it?
Yeah, absolutely.
Now we see the Bible tell us that James joined Mary and the disciples in the upper room to wait for the Holy Spirit.
What many people seem to think is that Jesus gives up on us when we fail to believe in him, but that really isn't the case.
No, but that's not what the Bible shows happened with Peter,
That's right.
and now even with his brother James.
James even seemed to be mocking Jesus about going up to the festival to be a public figure.
And here's how that reads in John chapter 7, verse 4. It said, "No one who wants to become a public figure acts in secret. Since you are doing these things, show yourself to the world."
This is a fine example of how the power of the resurrection is demonstrated by Jesus' persistence, by loving us and by showing his faith in us, is that we know here that James kind of mocked him, didn't quite believe in him, and yet we see here that after he's resurrected, Jesus made it a point to appear to James to convince him that he was the Messiah, right?
Right. Okay, this brings us to our next biblical thought, and that's great leaders arise out of great persecution.
All right, we're in Acts chapter 12, verse 17. It says, Peter motioned with his hand for them to be quiet and described how the Lord had brought him out of the prison. Tell James and the other brothers and sisters about this, he said, and then Peter left for another place.
Now here we see Peter tell a group of believers about his miraculous escape from prison, and that they should inform James and the others as well.
Sometime around 44 AD, Herod Agrippa put James, the brother of John, to death, and then he proceeded to arrest Peter, thinking he was going to do the same thing.
Which we know that Agrippa failed to put Peter to death, right?
No. Peter actually ended up getting an escort out of the prison by an angel, and then Peter figured out maybe hanging around in Jerusalem wasn't such a good idea anymore.
Maybe not.
James the Just seems to have taken the place of James, the son of Zebedee, after his martyrdom in 44 AD.
And after Peter left Jerusalem to escape Herod Agrippa's persecution.
James probably was the oldest brother of Jesus and believed to have lived a holy and ascetic life.
Now, it was held in tradition that he spent so much time in prayer that his knees were like those of a camel, they say.
That is a lot of prayer time, you guys. All right, now James was the local head of the oldest church and the leader of the most conservative portion of Jewish Christianity at the time.
Now, when the Christians of Antioch were concerned over whether Gentile Christians needed to be circumcised or, to be saved,
they sent Paul and Barnabas to confer with the Jerusalem church, so that James at that time, he stood up and he said it to everyone, hey, y'all, listen up, y'all, kind of thing going on here, right?
And it says that, y'all, in Acts chapter 15, verse 13 and 14. It says, when they finished, James spoke up. Brothers, he said, listen to me. Simon has told us how God first visited the Gentiles to take from them a people to be his own.
It was James that made the decision at the Jerusalem Council that Gentile Christians did not have to obey ancient Jewish laws.
Well, he played a prominent role in the formulation of the council's decision.
James was the last named figure to speak after Peter, Paul, and Barnabas, and he delivered what was called the decision at the time.
Well, he supported them all in being against the requirement that believers would need to be circumcised and follow the commands of Moses in order to be saved.
If you remember, Peter had cited his earlier revelation on how he was called by God to go speak with a Gentile,
right.
and notice that God accepted the Gentiles by faith alone by giving him the Holy Spirit at the time.
And James subsequently suggested prohibitions about eating blood, meat, sacrifice to idols, and also fornication as their only command of doing good as a Christian.
James makes it clear that it was by salvation alone, for all, by faith alone, and not by ritual observances.
That's right, and this came from a person who originally did not even believe that Jesus was the Christ.
There's the power of the cross going on right there, everybody. All right, this brings us to our next biblical thought, and that is sheep among wolves need to be like snakes.
Okay, and we're reading in Matthew chapter 10, verse 16. It said, I am sending you out like sheep among wolves. Therefore be as shrewd as snakes and as innocent as doves.
Here we see Jesus warning his followers that they need to be aware that he's sending them into a cruel world.
Cold, cruel world.
Cold and cruel, for
and that
sure.
they needed to be as shrewd as snakes as they bear witness to his gospel.
Jesus goes on to tell his followers that they would be persecuted just like he was.
And they were, weren't they? And James goes on to serve as the leader over the oldest church at Jerusalem until his death.
We don't really have a biblical account of James' death, but the Jewish historian Josephus reported that Jewish leaders stoned James to death in Jerusalem.
And also in another account from Eusebius, the bishop of the church in Caesarea, James was thrown from the top of the temple and beaten to death with a club.
The non-biblical records say that the scribes and Pharisees came to James and asked him if he would speak to the people about Jesus.
He's like, oh yeah, I will.
Yeah, I'm sure.
So their intent really was to allow him to speak to the large crowds at Passover if he would tell them that Jesus was not the Messiah. Didn't quite go that way.
That's the interesting part. See, the scribes and the Pharisees knew that James was greatly respected among all the people, and they knew that the people would listen to him, and I think they were trying to coax him into going, stand up and just say Jesus was a good man or a prophet, but not the Messiah. And of course, I'm sure that James was very glad to be able to testify about Jesus in front of everybody.
I mean, they told him that he would be permitted to stand on the summit of the temple so that he could be seen clearly.
And so that his voice could be heard by everyone coming to the annual Passover that year.
That's right. You know, James knew that all the tribes and Gentile converts coming for the annual Passover routinely gathered in the courtyard below the summit of the temple. How convenient, huh?
To the scribes and Pharisees' disappointment, James boldly testified that Christ himself sits in heaven and at the right hand of God.
And that he will come on the clouds of heaven to get his people.
Hearing James' testimony, they decided to go up and throw him down from the summit of the temple.
And they did this thinking that the people would be afraid and not believe his testimony.
The recorded account says that they threw the just man down, but he was not killed, so they began to stone him to death.
Now, while they proceeded in stoning him, James prayed aloud for God to forgive them.
Hearing James' prayer, one of the temple priests screamed so loud, trying to stop them, saying, "The just man is praying for us. Stop what you're doing."
And James' death still didn't come fast enough for the angry mob.
So one of the fullers took his staff, and he took his staff, which he was used to wringing out his garments from the dye, and he hurled it at the head of the just man and killed him. And so here we see the accounts that are non-biblical, but they're kind of all in a line with he was thrown off the temple, he was being stoned, and then he was actually clubbed to death. So we kind of see this coming forward here out of the records, which is very interesting.
Now, it may seem that James pulled a quick one on the Pharisees and that he may have been just a little deceptive.
But we tend to think that he simply complied with the request of the Pharisees by being able to speak about Jesus and give his testimony.
Right. He was asked to give his testimony about Jesus, and he faithfully spoke about Jesus from the temple summit.
In this situation, we see the power of an angry mob who would not stop, even at the request of one of their priests.
And if Satan can use an angry mob in this fashion,
think about how much more God can use a loving, caring group of Christians who unite and come together in order to change their community.
That's right.
All right, we want to thank you for tuning into this particular teaching, and we do want to invite you to come visit us at awordontheword.tv. And remember, go serve the King by serving others.
Thank you for joining Les and Tracy King for A Word on the Word. Visit awordontheword.tv to receive their latest audio or video broadcast. A Word on the Word is sponsored by First Century Ministry